a regular guy. Watch football and drink beer till I die. But instead I read Kafka and write poems that make me cry. God, let me be a regular guy.
That was the Swedish band Freak Kitchen with their track Regular Guy, and it's a good example of how Kafka has become shorthand for expressing the irregular. If we're yearning for a normality, often stereotypical, fictional, or somehow not as real as we imagine it to be, and if we feel at sea in a senseless or disorientating mental state, we might call that the Kafkaesque. By far the most irregular experiences of all Kafka's characters is the plight of Gregor Samsa, a man who wakes up one morning to find he's turned into a pest, a freakish insect. Gregor suddenly loses his regular life of 4 a.m. starts, business trips, a strict routine in the outside world, and is confined to his room in an alienating bodily form for more than a month. Die Verwandlung, or the Metamorphosis, is a literary classic, has made it onto many German syllabi at universities or even schools, and is part of pop culture. The story is the subject of this podcast. We'll reflect on reading, and even watching, Kafka in quarantine. I say watching because, like many of us in lockdown, which for me is approaching 2 months now, I've turned not only to literature, but also to performances being streamed online. One of these is the 2011 adaptation of The Metamorphosis for the Royal Ballet, choreographed by Arthur Pita. I'm Seán Williams, and in this podcast I'll hear from Arthur, I'll talk to academic colleagues, Doctors Lucia Ruprecht and Emily Troscianko, and listen to my long-suffering students at the University of Sheffield, Ben Whiteside, Jonny Shipton, and Rowan Evenden. The podcast is made for the Ingeborg Bachmann Centre for Austrian Literature and Culture at the Institute of Modern Languages Research in London, and for the Austrian Cultural Forum. Now, we can count Kafka as an Austrian author of sorts. He wrote mostly in Prague, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In Pita's production, there's little language, though we hear Czech on the streets, the language of the majority in everyday Bohemia. You wouldn't expect voice in a ballet, so I began by asking Arthur about the thinking behind his linguistic choices.
In a way, it was like watching a foreign film. But you don't need the subtitles. You just know that it's a language, so it becomes like a texture. The person who talks the most is the maid, and she actually talks to him in Swiss German, and that's mostly because she was a Swiss German, and because I thought German would have been perfect, but she spoke Swiss German. We thought it actually at that time would be very easy. People would have travelled anyway and could have been working in other countries. So at least it gave us kind of the flavour. But she spoke it quite fast, and it really was just the same thing. It was really just to find a texture so that it exaggerated the fact that Gregor Samsa was very mute in his insect state.
Actually, the Swiss German might have been pretty historically accurate. Characters in the Swiss late 19th century classic story Heidi, for example, go to work in German houses. Many itinerant service workers came from the Alps at that time. I asked Lucia Ruprecht at the University of Cambridge, though, to tell us more about the historical background of Kafka's story, written in 1912 and published in 1915. It's a story that turns out to be well suited to balletic interpretation.
1912 is a time, high modernism, of course, in European and German and European literature. It is a time where many writers developed a huge interest in bodily movement and in gesture. And that is partly caused by what might be called a crisis of representation, a crisis of literary representation, where language and words were seen perhaps to no longer be able to represent a new world and a new self within that world. So this crisis of representation then led to a huge interest in alternative ways of expression, including dance. Here again, what we see in the Metamorphosis, of course, we have a human being, we have a man turning into a beetle. This is not a text about dance. And yet it gains such gestural and choreographic quality that really, even though Kafka does not directly talk about dance, what we have in front of us might be something akin to a dance.
Of course, over the century since the Metamorphosis was published, it's been interpreted in what seems like 100 different ways. Emily Troscianko from Oxford sums them up in just a couple of sentences.
I guess the cynical interpretation is we're living sort of hollowed out, mechanized lives. This weird physical threat comes along and transforms life into something even more rubbish, and then social stuff gets disrupted, and then maybe we die. So that's one way of reading Kafka's story. There are many, many ways of reading it. As with all of Kafka's texts, it's a text that invites a plethora of divergent interpretations. And over the years, people have said it means everything from, a critique of capitalism to an investigation of dualist models of self and everything in between. And occasionally people have also taken the more, what I think is a more interesting meta perspective and said, isn't it interesting that a text like this, which is in some ways quite a simple story about a man waking up to find that he's transformed into monstrous vermin, isn't it interesting that this text can lead people in such crazily contrasting directions? What's actually going on here? That's the kind of question that I, in my research, have found it more interesting to focus on than what do I think is the meaning of it, which, any person who reads any text is doing for themselves and probably enjoying the process of trying to do.
Well, it's that kind of personal interpretation that I'm trying to probe in this podcast. We'll return to Emily's kind of research questions in a moment. More generally, she wrote a book called Kafka's Cognitive Realism, so I wanted to know whether we might approach Kafka's The Metamorphosis in any particular way at present, given our radically changed circumstances in our daily lives and our greater physical confinement.
So I guess, if you think that the pandemic era is an era of profound uncertainty, which amongst other things it is. It's an uprooting of things that we at least used to be under the illusion. It's an uprooting of things that we at least used to think were more certain than they probably ever were. So if you've got that realization of profound uncertainty, then I guess there's two broad responses that you can make to it. One is try to pretend it's not happening, so cling on to the forms of certainty that are still accessible to you. And I suppose, then Kafka would be a sort of odd choice of text to engage with because it's not making your life very easy, but you could then, pick up this story and see in it a little parable about, I don't know, how a family can survive even a really bizarrely unpleasant occurrence, because, the family at the end gets to finally leave the stifling, frightening apartment and go out into the sunshine and sort of reclaim their old vigour, or a vigour that they've never even had before. So that's one way of responding to uncertainty, and I guess the other is to embrace it in some way and to say, okay, this uncertainty existed all the time. Now we're being forced to see it with a clarity that we hadn't, because all the structures of apparent reliability had accrued such that we didn't have to. And if you're in that frame of mind, well, you might turn to Kafka and do something rather different, which is sit with the fact that it's not possible to come to any very satisfactory singular interpretation of this or, of anything else. And that's harder because, the sort of cognitively easy route tends to be just minimize entropy, minimize the effort that goes into dealing with entropy, and just pretend that stuff is predictable.
So how have some of us responded to Kafka's story on such a personal level? I watched the ballet streamed by the Royal Opera House together with some of my students.
Hi, my name's Ben Whiteside. I studied RAD and IDTA ballet for 8 years, and now I study Germanics at the University of Sheffield. I thought it was a very nice interpretation of the Kafkaesque through the medium of ballet. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think the use of props and the use of scenery really added to it, and it was like a modern form of ballet, not really classical, which is great.
The choreographer, Arthur Pita, reflects on why his production is not only modern, but contemporary, really contemporary, amid coronavirus.
I always felt that the story was a very modern story because it deals with it deals with so many things. But because that one of the underlying themes I think would be anxiety, and I think that was one of the first things everybody was feeling straight away when we were told about lockdown. That everybody immediately felt, and I think we are all still feeling quite anxious just about life in general. So immediately there was an immediate link over there, and then when the Royal Ballet announced they were going to stream it, I suddenly realized that there were just so many parallels with the story of the Metamorphosis with what we're going through, but also particularly because of a few things that I had set. Because in the story, Mrs. Samsa suffers from, she's asthmatic. I exaggerated that in the story. So one of the first images in the opening of the piece is Mrs. Samsa going to a 1950s breathing machine, which immediately kind of reflects what's going on at the moment with COVID-19 and people needing to, the fact that it attacks the lungs. Just already that connection, and also the fact that that Kafka himself suffered terribly from tuberculosis. So there's something that's already there, and the way that that I staged it is that you do see Gregor Samsa leaving the apartment, leaving the house, but really the family, the mother doesn't, and the father is lounging around the house. So in a way, they're already in some kind of quarantine themselves, and then he kind of when he comes home and he wakes up, there's something has happened in the house. So I guess there are a lot of parallels to what we're feeling now, to what happens in the story of the Metamorphosis in a kind of metaphorical sense, which I was immediately fascinated with. And then so the first thing about the lockdown that I was worried about when they were going to stream, I thought, I wonder if this is just people are going to want to watch something that is darker and upsetting and ultimately about someone dying. But interesting enough, we got a really nice hit of people watching, and I got a lot of nice comments of people who hadn't seen it who and so it's been cathartic for them to watch it at this time. So that's good, because I think often people think, everyone's upset, so we should just put on something nice and fluffy. But actually, I think it's sometimes the opposite.
A reminder there that the unprecedented measures taken because of the pandemic can be very difficult, and literature and the arts can affect us deeply, each according to their own circumstances.
My name's Jonny. I'm a final year student of German at the University of Sheffield, and what most resembled my experience of lockdown in the ballet was the world changing so completely and so instantly around Gregor, and also his having to come to terms with the fact that that would have such implications on his own aspirations for the future, for as long as that remained the case.
I found that a poignant reaction, and the Verwandlung or the Metamorphosis may provoke an especially emotional response at the moment. I intuitively agree with the idea that the arts are cathartic, but let's hear a contrasting perspective. Empirical studies seem to suggest that we should perhaps be cautious, depending on the specifics of our mental state. Emily Troscianko's research has moved from Kafka to literature and mental health, especially concerning eating disorders. Her blog for the magazine Psychology Today evokes another of Kafka's stories, a hunger artist. I asked Emily if we can draw any broader lessons from her work and apply them to lockdown.
I think it's really dangerous to generalise at all, and particularly to generalise, for example, with an assumption or a belief that generally literature will be doing good stuff and that the risks are negligible. So the most extensive empirical investigation that I've made of the interactions between literary reading or fiction or narrative reading and mental health actually suggests that there's a lot of harm being done by people reading stuff that they choose to read when they have eating disorders or are vulnerable to them. And of course, eating disorders may be an outlier. There are reasons to think it might be an outlier because, eating disorders are more subject to nasty forms of sort of competitiveness and glamorizing than many other mental health conditions. But, others, that happens with others too. It was really striking in the research that I conducted that when distinguishing between fiction about eating disorders, so for example where the main character has an eating disorder or where it's thematically quite salient, that on the one hand versus whatever other type of fiction people like to read, that the effects reported were almost universally negative for the stuff about eating disorders when these people had personal experience themselves. So on mood, on self-esteem, feelings about your body and diet and exercise habits, neutral at best and normally quite significantly negative reactions were, or consequences of reading were reported, admittedly often long after the fact, and this is only self-report and so on. But there's a real potential for the wrong book at the wrong time to do something really bad, or for you to respond to it in a way that ends up doing harm. Conversely, the other stuff that people like to read, whether it was sci-fi or romantic fiction or whatever, that was a much more complex picture and rather more positive, particularly on the mood dimension. So just being cheered up by reading something nice is a simple effect maybe, but it's an important one. So that's just one little example of where I think we need to be really careful about recommending that people read literature because reading's good for us and say watching TV isn't. There's just so much that may be going on when it comes to the interpretive filter which one is inclined to put on the text at hand, and unless you've investigated the nature of that filter a bit and what it might be for a given individual, then it's just really hard to make any confident predictions, I think.
Literature can be liberating. We should remember that it can also bring you down. Perhaps the message is not to self-medicate if we're in a particularly dark place, with books or with anything else.
To the extent that there is any theory of bibliotherapy, so the use of books for therapeutic purposes, the theory tends to state that you should basically, find a book that's as close to the situation that you find yourself in as possible. Read that book, learn from how the character deals with it, maybe go through some kind of cathartic moment where you realise, oh, it was like this all along or whatever, and then find your way through it to a solution, maybe the solution that the character also came up with, and then you'll be sorted. Of course, the boundary between a mental illness and lesser forms of sort of cognitive emotional distress, or maybe not lesser, but non-clinical, whatever, that borderline is fuzzy, and I'm not sure which side of it we should necessarily put lockdown, confinement, social isolation and all that stuff. Maybe it could be a good idea for some of us to try reading texts about social isolation and confinement and see what we can learn from them, but maybe we should just read happy books or fascinating books about quite other topics and just let our minds roam. I suspect the second strategy is lower risk and potentially just as high gain. The reading about confinement, potentially high gain as well, but riskier.
Insofar as Kafka represents cognition, he not only describes the world of the mind, but also the body, of course. The Metamorphosis is especially corporeal.
I'm Rowan Evenden, and I'm a student of archaeology and German at the University of Sheffield. Having previously studied Die Verwandlung I think that watching it performed as a ballet really emphasised the physical nature of Gregor's condition and the lack of control that he feels over his body. And this resonated with the lack of control over my own body that I've been feeling during lockdown. I think that many people are currently at odds with their bodies, be it through no longer having control of their diet, not being able to go to the gym, or just not doing those day-to-day activities through which you'd usually get exercise without even noticing. I think that not only is this reflected in the lack of control that Gregor clearly feels, but the ballet also emphasises the grotesqueness of his condition. And I think that a feeling of grotesqueness within yourself is a really common feeling which comes alongside not feeling in control of your body. And for a lot of people, these feelings have flared up because of the quarantine. And I think that in this way, the ballet of Die Verwandlung really resonated with my own experiences of quarantine.
I felt fairly similar to Rowan this week. Without wanting to sound too trivial, I can't be the only one who's torn a ligament after taking up running all too enthusiastically. I chatted to Lucia Ruprecht to hear more about the metamorphosis and the body.
As Kafka is actually a writer who gives a great deal of attention to the human body, and he's also a writer of very detailed descriptions. If you don't mind, I would actually like to go back very quickly to the beginning, the famous beginning of this story, and the way in which Kafka describes Gregor's insect body. There, I'm quoting from the English translation that says, Gregor was lying on his hard, as it were, armor-plated back, and when he lifted his head a little, he could see his dome-like brown belly divided into stiff arched segments, on top of which the bedquilt could hardly keep in position and was about to slide off completely. His numerous legs, which were pitifully thin compared to the rest of his bulk, waved helplessly before his eyes. Unquote. So this is, as we know, this is the way Kafka, at the beginning of his story, describes Gregor Samsa's body. And then I was wondering, for a choreographer, Arthur Pita, what might he have thought reading this description of a body? And, what to do if you want a dancer to represent this kind of body? It's really, I found this a striking question. So the Royal Ballet's principal dancer, Edward Watson, who performs the role of Gregor, actually says in commentaries that Peter's choreography then turned out to be the most extreme way that he had ever used his body. That's the dancer who says that. And given that this comes from a classically trained ballet dancer, is actually quite a powerful statement. So when we watch Peter's piece, I think what we see and what we realize is that they really try to make the movement as non-human as possible. So what's clear is that Edward Watson as Gregor, that he never walks. He can't pick anything up, for instance. He really seems to try to make his movement as insect as he could. At the same time, I was thinking to understand this a little bit more by thinking of what it means if a dancer tries to adapt insect movement. And then I thought a bit about insects, because in some way, so if we think about, shall we say, I think as Peter tried to do the insect in the human and the human in the insect, we might actually start perceiving uncanny resemblances here. And that's maybe what's so excruciating too. Yeah. There is actually a scholar of English literature, Eric Brown, wrote on insect poetics, and I found that intriguing when Brown says, I'm quoting, that so that the alien appearance of insects really might be more of a resemblance to humans as we normally think of. They have arms and legs, but 6 instead of 4. There's a properly oriented head, but with disproportionate eyes and mouths and perhaps even ears. There's the exoskeleton, of course. There's a prominent abdomen, but no apparent sex organs. So insects perhaps embody both excess and loss. And maybe it's that ambivalence that makes us cringe when we watch Edward Watson, embodying an insect.
The animal life of human and insect have bodily things in common. So however absurd Gregor Samsa's Metamorphosis, it would be wrong to represent it comically, a particular risk for illustration. Former ballet dancer, Royal Academy examiner, and German studies scholar Dr. Margaret Kajewski reminded me that Kafka insisted to his publishers that the insect should not be portrayed on the cover of Die Verwandlung. Choreographer Arthur Pita makes a similar point about the ambivalence of Gregor's situation, expressing it in terms of abstraction.
There's so many things about COVID-19 that are just so, we just don't know. There's so much unknown about it that it's quite like an abstract thing, and I keep thinking that we keep just seeing these little, every time you're on the news, you just see the little diagram, all the kind of illustrations they have of what the virus looks like, the ball with all those spikes shooting out, which is quite an abstract, because it's invisible, we can't see it. So we have like a different visual for it, or there's also some kind of people using an emojicon, which looks like it's like a little green virus. I don't know if you've seen that little emojicon. So I find that fascinating, which is the same thing, which I think Kafka did brilliantly by why did he choose an insect? Could have been anything. But in a weird way, it's the reason I think he chose an insect is it's the lowest form, so it starts to, it's a very, very, very low status symbol. But what I mean is in the same sense that it eventually becomes abstract, which is what I really wanted to try and do within the production. So we didn't want to put him in a bug suit, and create like a massive bug suit where he looked like an actual insect. It had to be more abstract, and so I had to try to find a way for it to have a different reading of what was going on with him.
Reflecting more on Gregor's physical predicament actually allows for a positive twist, and ultimately, even a happier take-home message for lockdown living. We have to accept Gregor's awful transformation. His family doesn't question it, but that fundamental constraint or lack of explanation opens up new possibilities for exploration.
When we think from the perspective of literature and dance, confined does not necessarily mean restrictive in a negative sense. So restrictions are not necessarily disabling. They can be generative, and they can bring about new movement, new writing. And this is actually, I think, what the corona situation has brought about in my thinking on the Metamorphosis as both a literary piece and a dance piece. And I think that confinement gives rise to creativity, and where restrictions then become a task, as it were. So the task that Kafka might have set himself was what happens when a human being suddenly turns into an insect. And the creative task that Arthur Pita, the choreographer of the Metamorphosis, might have set himself was how to transpose insect movement onto the human body. What is then so fascinating, and what I think also we learn by watching the text transposition onto the stage, is that acceptance of a new situation also implies a certain type of appreciation of the possibilities that are opened up through this different state. I think this is the way I would like to put it, because what I found so striking is that then the movement range, once Edward Watson embodies the insect, his movement range completely changes, and it really becomes an exploration of expanded movement within a new set of restrictions. And that is what makes it choreographically so interesting. When we see Edward Watson as insect, it's clear that he cannot use his body no longer in any sort of more typical everyday ways, but he uses it in, it becomes a stretching and a bending and a testing and a trying, and what we see are very new contortions. I must say, I had to think about another passage in Kafka too that I like very much. It's a passage maybe halfway through the story that talks about these newfound movement possibilities in the literary text as well. And maybe I'm reading just a few lines because I find them so, well, beautifully striking, really. They also actually point up an enjoyment in movement that otherwise is often overlooked in the Metamorphosis. Yeah, often we focus much more on the very dark, the dark aspects of this story. So the passage that I had in mind was, it's a description of Gregor actually climbing up the walls in his room. And it says, by way of diversion, he took to crawling to and fro over the walls and the ceiling. He especially enjoyed hanging from the ceiling. It was quite different from lying on the ground. He could breathe more easily. He felt a gentle swaying sensation through his body. And in the almost blissful state of distraction he experienced up there, he would occasionally, to his own surprise, let go and crash to the floor. But by now, of course, he had more control over his body than before and did not injure himself even by falling from such a height, unquote. So I saw actually quite a bit of that passage also in the choreography, in Pita's choreography, that new control of the body.
Gregor isn't the only character who tries to move in new ways. In Pita's ballet, the mother does keep fit videos in the kitchen. In between making this podcast, I've been taking part in Pilates classes on Zoom. And in the final line of Kafka's story, Gregor's sister stretches out her young body as her new normal begins. All of this leads Lucia Ruprecht to read in Kafka a rather fun PE lesson for our lives right now.
Yeah, I must say, I too was, I found that really funny, that sequence in Peter's piece where, you're absolutely right, the mother is actually doing her at-home exercise in front of the telly. It's very Corona, suddenly. And what about Kafka making us think differently about our current situation, maybe also really from a choreographic point of view? I think, as I said at the beginning, Kafka is a writer who gives a great deal of attention to bodies, to bodily movement, to gesture, and to choreography. And I think that is something that we can take with us for the current situation, because after all, we are forced very much especially when we are outside on the streets, little choreographies unfold suddenly, where people have to watch the distance, the 1.50 meter or 2 meter distance between them. And I think what would be really wonderful if these choreographies were not seen so much as a chore or as something that suddenly, actually as a new restriction in itself too, of course, because we have to watch our movements much more. But if they could be seen, maybe if we could see them from a more creative perspective and maybe even start enjoying them a little bit, and maybe not persisting, on the straight line, as you can see so many times now on the street, where some people persist, on walking the straight line, and they will not give way, so that actually the person who opposite them then needs to move or needs to, stop for a moment, etc. I think it's fun actually to consider those new street choreographies a bit more creatively and play with them perhaps a little bit more. And I think that would be very Kafka, to be honest, not see them so much as limiting.
The band Fahren Urlaub Racing Team have got it right with their song Heute tanzen. Read great literature, take time out for Kafka, but for today, just dance. I'll let them have the final word then, serving as the conclusion for this podcast. After all, Kafka writes that for Gregor Samsa, getting out of bed was more a game than an effort, and he rocked with rhythm.
Tolstoi kann warten. Kafka hat alle Zeit der Welt. Literatur ist wichtig, doch wir leben nicht von Buchstaben allein. Gelegentlich darf das Niveau auch flacher sein. Es bringt doch nichts, sich ein Leben lang hinter Büchern zu verschanzen. Morgen kann ich locker wieder weiterlesen, aber heute muss ich erst mal tanzen.
These thoughts on choreography, culture and the arts were produced by me, Seán Williams. The sound was engineered by Ian Hunter. My thanks go to Arthur Pita, Lucia Ruprecht, Emily Troscianko, and Ben Whiteside, Jonny Shipton, and Rowan Evenden. The podcast was supported by the Ingeborg Bachmann Centre in conjunction with the Austrian Cultural Forum and the University of Sheffield. Thanks are owed too to the Royal Opera House.